I'm Corey Andrew Powell, and I am joined today by Steph Watts, executive producer and development executive, specializing in crime and justice programming and creating compelling fiction and nonfiction content across all platforms. Now, Steph launched his career at Court TV, producing live and taped national trial coverage, managing all aspects of media logistics, overseeing editorial accuracy, and producing larger format documentaries. He currently appears in a six-part documentary on the Discovery Plus channel, and he co-hosts a new investigative crime podcast called Case by Case. Steph Watts, welcome to Motivational Mondays.
Thank you. That introduction was motivational. I appreciate that
Yes, well,
so much, Corey.
you
Thank
are
you.
very busy, sir. Yes, indeed.
Thanks.
Well, you're very
In
welcome.
this new world order we exist in, I guess, right? You
Yeah, I
know.
mean, well, look, you were always busy even before that happened, clearly. But I do want to know, though, when it comes to that line of work, first and foremost, I'm really curious about, there is a distinction between being a TV journalist and then being a TV journalist working in the crime segment of the business. So, what inspired you to work in that particular area of TV journalism?
Well, when I'm originally from Canada. When I first moved here 100 years ago, my very first job was interning at the Village Voice, and I had a chance to
Oh,
do some really investigative stuff with great journalists like Frank Owen sort of comes to mind, and Frank and I had done a whole investigative into like New York nightclubs and drug use, and it was
mm,
just really fascinating for me to be in these kind of darker worlds and asking questions. And then from there, actually, my first real job was with Brill's Content Magazine, which was Steve Brill, who at the time had actually started Core TV. And it was a really interesting magazine, which eventually went online, really all about sort of inside the media. It was a little bit inside baseball, a little bit ahead of its time. But when the magazine folded, I had an opportunity to go over to Court TV. And basically, I remember Bonnie Joy hired me, this woman. She was like exasperated, like needed somebody to start right away. She's like, "Can you start tomorrow?" Like literally
wow.
like one of those movie scenes. And I was like, "Can I start tomorrow?" Sure, So I started in documentaries and just, really, being personable and asking the right questions. And I think intuitively, when you wonder about something or something doesn't feel right, that's really at the core of kind of what I do.
Mm,
Essentially, I've had
right.
the luxury of building a reputation and establishing myself with, law enforcement and judges and courts and
Mm.
networks all across the country. It's been a really great and interesting and learning journey.
Well, two things come to mind when you tell me that story. One is it makes perfect sense why, since you did that original work at the Village Voice with that whole like the club scene and the drugs, it makes perfect sense why you would later go on to do that piece on Michael Alec
Right.
and the party monster
Yeah.
thing,
Right.
because that was
That was
crazy
that
too.
was part of my series for ID, on sort of inside cults and inside darker worlds or worlds we didn't know that much about. And I felt like as I, get hired to do these projects and pitched, I was like, that's an interesting, cult club world. And yeah, I had the opportunity. I think, I did one of the last interviews with Michael because, as you know, he died this
Yeah.
year,
Hmm.
Christmas. And that's another whole topic. But like for somebody to still have the opportunity to get on with their life and come out and destroy their life, the same way that they, close to how they destroyed the person who they murdered.
Mm,
They were high on drugs and, admittedly, and for him to come out and continue that behavior, it's just, what did he learn in there? What a waste of money. What a waste of
right.
time. It was sad. But yeah, that was called Deadly Devotions, that series. And,
Hmm.
that was an interesting fit, but thank you for that connection.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about that.
Yes. And for me too, I was a young teenager hanging out in New York City during the time when that actually happened, or maybe I was like in my late teens, early 20s. And so I can remember actually still, and I think I told you this once before, I can remember actually seeing the flyers on phone booths of "Have you seen Angel?" Like I was there when that happened. So, to be in New York City when something that crazy happened. And for those of you who don't know, just Google Michael Alec and you'll get the story. Um, but you
Well, there
started
was a
with Court.
movie about it, right?
Oh,
There
right.
was a movie.
Macaulay Culkin,
Macaulay Culkin played a
Party
party
Monster.
monster,
Right.
right? And then I did the actual documentary on which you watched, which I
Mhm.
appreciated. Yeah, it was interesting. It was one of my jailhouse interviews was with him
Yeah,
and
wow, it
Angel's
was
brother. It was a really
powerful.
emotional story.
Yeah, I
They
mean,
all they all are, but that one,
kinda that kinda
it's
hit you a
interesting.
bit harder, that one.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, with Court TV, having that, being that you started there, it makes me think in a way because that was like I think when I first remember Court TV, that's going back to like 2004, maybe
Hmm.
2003, a long
Yeah.
while back, and there were not many shows like that really. So Court TV to me seems like it was one that sparked this genre. Now there's such an overabundance on cable of all those sorts of, ID,
Mhm.
investigative and forensic. Do you feel in a way that show was a catalyst for those other programs?
Yeah, I believe so. I think from my personal experiences, I learned, I was forced to quickly learn about the judicial system in this
Mm,
country
yeah.
and its strengths and its weaknesses. We were really schooled on editorial accuracy. We were in courts every day covering trials. There was really no margin for error, but we were also airing the trials live or taped.
Mm,
So, the stories played out themselves. But what I really started to notice early on, Corey, was that it was a big, what's the word, disparity in the coverage of white people versus black people and the
right.
portrayal of people of color within the judicial system. I remember a lot of times we'd wait if it's a big court case, like, I don't know, like Casey Anthony or
Hmm.
something we were waiting for. The judge still had other matters of business prior to those. And I would remember that the inmates would come in chained, dressed in orange. And I was always aware like 95% of those people are black.
Mm, mm,
What and a lot of them were not violent offenders, they were drug offenses, robberies, and it always struck me as they would come in, and it reminded me of slavery. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you,
yeah.
those images always stuck with me, and I'm like, why are there so many people of color? This is early on. Okay, just I know people can say, well, how did you not know that? I'm talking, this is 20 years ago,
And also, you were
and I
not
was
from
from
here,
Canada.
right? You're not from this
Right, I'm
country.
from Canada, so my lens on racism and my lens on that whole is different,
Hmm.
thankfully. So that always stuck with me. So even early on, I remember that it was important for us to tell stories of color. And I remember one of the first ones I did was Ray Caruth, and it was a horrific story. He paid for the Carolina Panthers and hired a hitman to kill his girlfriend, and it was a terrible story, but it was one of the first ones that we told where a person of color, where everybody was equal in the story. It wasn't like stranger danger black guy. I mean, the
Hmm.
nation saw it with OJ, but OJ was famous,
Yeah,
so there
yeah.
was a different, celebrities get treated differently. So
Hmm. Yeah, you know what I found fascinating about the OJ trial, and since you brought that up, and disturbing at the same time, was because there was a sense in the African American community that there was always two justice systems where white people, especially affluent white people, were more likely to get away with crimes and even heinous crimes. There was a sense within the black community as well that OJ, I think for the most part, at some point, we all were like, yeah, he probably did this, right? But there was also still cheering and victory, a sense of victory when he was acquitted, because it was almost like this weird game of like playing chess, where it's like, wow, well, we finally got one that didn't. It was a very strange sort of way
yeah,
to watch that trial unfold and cheer for someone who you
right.
thought was probably guilty.
I covered the OJ civil case, but for that trial, I was still in Canada, and I remember that moment. It was pivotal for me because I remember I was in a mall, and I was like, "Why are people cheering?" Two people are dead.
Right, right.
Many people believe that this person, regardless of the color of his skin, committed this crime, and yet there's cheers and bars like it's a sporting event,
Mm,
and it just didn't make sense to me, and that really
yeah,
triggered for me, and that was a moment for me that like I really want to explore how this happened, and that was a really turning point for me. I remember that. It's kind of
yeah.
like I don't remember a lot of things in my life, like 9/11, where you were like
Hmm.
OJ Simpson. It was one of those
Right.
things like, for me personally, I remember where I was. I remember that moment. I remember how disturbing, upsetting it was to see people react that way.
Yeah,
Look, a
it was
jury
really
ruled
disconcerting.
however they ruled, and I respect that. But still, that was you know uh, the decline of American culture at that
It
moment.
was really, yeah. I was working in a restaurant at the time, so I remember like that moment. Everyone was like waiting and watching whatever they could to see it, and then I heard the entire mall erupt and like, various stores and restaurants. And yeah, it was very strange. But, the bigger point of the story, though, that I love that you're sharing, especially with this being a leadership podcast, is that you're using your platform to equal out some of that disparity in those
Mhm.
stories that are being told, and you've shared that, for example, while the media is covering the story of like a missing white girl, there's like 20 to 30 black women who you've never heard of, or Native American or Hispanic, who are also missing, and they're not in the media. Why do you think? Well, I mean,
Well,
I wouldn't
I
say
got
why, but I mean, because it's a loaded question. But I mean,
right.
on its, on the surface, is it just is it racism, or like what would you call it that makes that happen?
It's a couple of things. I mean, I have a theory. I call it pretty missing white girl syndrome, and I think it's what the world suffers from. At some point, the media suffers from. At some point, there a narrative became came to the surface within in the meetings that I would be in, and it was like stories of people of color don't rate to the white people. Essentially, they would say white people aren't interested in the stories of people of color.
Hmm.
And if you hear that enough, you buy into it. But I always questioned it. I was always like, wait, who said that? Where's the statistics? Show me the spreadsheets on this false narrative that was created. And
Yeah.
finally, being a little bit of a badass, I guess, an outsider, like I took a stand against it because I was like, wait, I'm a storyteller, and there's a whole plethora of interesting and compelling stories that have dramatically affected people. And regardless of the fact that their skin color is different, I don't see why we can't tell these stories. And I got to the point in the networks where I would say to them, they'd say things to me like, I'd pitch a story. I'm going to take you right inside. And they'd say to me, Steph, this story's just too sad upon sad for us. And I'd be like, you do crime. We just did Ted Bundy. He murdered 1 million people. Like, how is this story every Saturday? Let's take sad and replace it with black upon black and have a real
Mm.
conversation. I took
Yeah.
it a step further and I said to, in an article that I wrote, that the um, stories of white killers, women killers, Casey Anthony, Jodi Arias, Eileen
Eileen
Warnos, the
Warnos.
list
Yeah.
goes on and on, took precedent over victims of color. That was more important to tell these sensationalistic stories. That's changed now, though. I think with, there was a quick turnaround. I think with, Breonna Taylor and
Yeah.
George Floyd and all these cases, the systemic racism and historic racism within the media and within the justice system's been put on trial, and I
Hmm.
think that it's being questioned. And I think people are beginning to make an effort. And I mean, I hate to be the one to be like, I told y'all so, but
Yeah.
there's compelling stories, and for me, like one of the big pivotal moments was a story that we did for A&E on Rodney Reed, and a lot of people might know that recently because Kim Kardashian jumped on board, which I respect her, to help save
Mm.
Rodney from execution. But prior to that, years ago, I did a story for A&E when he was a black man. He's on death row for crime he did not commit. Murder of Stacy Stites. Stacy was murdered probably by her white police officer boyfriend. They said, well, we tried him. He was convicted. He's sentenced to death. I was down in the town Bastrop, Texas, 50 miles outside of Austin, and 100 years back in time, I call it,
Mm.
where the N word is prevalent there. And I finally had to say to them, could you guys stop talking like that, or I will report that you speak like that in rooms full of people who look like me.
Mm.
But further to more, within a week, Corey, of being there, I found, witnesses who was like, oh yeah, Rodney would come in here all the time to see Stacy at work. But when her boyfriend would come in, she'd run and hide in the back. They said they couldn't find witnesses. How am I, just as young budding journalist, finding witnesses in a small town? And finally, we presented the story on A&E, and they stayed his execution because it was so glaringly
Mm.
embarrassing for them that they said that they couldn't. He was stranger danger and didn't. Their whole case, Corey, was that he didn't even know Stacy. I went to his bail bonds lady, this old German white woman, who he would go and pay money to because he had done minor crimes, nothing major. And she would tell me, oh yeah, Stacy came with him all the time.
Mm. Wow.
It's like, so my point is, because they didn't want to do the work, because it was easier to pin a crime on and close a case and put it on somebody of color. And that's
Yeah.
still prevalent to this day. That's still happening. But we've got prosecutors' offices all across the country now that are forming task forces that are re-examining every single case in their office for these exact examples that I give you of mistakes that were happening. So I commend all the prosecutors' offices across the country that are doing that. These
Wow.
task force that they've created.
Yeah, well, I commend you, sir, because
Wow.
that is powerful as well. I mean, that's why I asked early on, like, there's TV journalism, and then there's like, potentially what you just shared is that some work you produced actually helped change the minds of
Mhm.
people who are in charge of the execution of someone
Mhm.
and had them go back and reevaluate because they could no longer deny it because that's how good the investigative reporting was. And so
Right.
I want to make sure that anyone who's listening who really is thinking about um, a career in investigative reporting, that's a bigger picture for you to think about, like really making a
Mhm.
difference, right? Not just going out because it's a job, but
Mhm.
there's a chance to change lives. And with that said, I was curious to know, Steph, when you decide to do a project or feature a story, is it something that you do because it's based on pop culture, it's captivating the global audience, so it'll be, good for ratings and do a good piece? Or is it something that it sparks some sort of emotive response in you and you're like, I gotta get in there and figure out what happened. Something's not right. Which one, or are they both part of it?
That's a very good question, Mr. Corey. It's a very good question. I
Thank you,
think
sir.
I think to answer that question, in the past, it's been doing the pop culture stories. So, for example, when I was when I was with a particular production company, when I did my series American Murder Mysteries, I did Casey Anthony. I did the sit down with George and Cindy.
Mm,
It was a big deal.
yeah.
At the same time for the series, then we did, Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson.
Mm,
Then, that aired on ID, which is then Oxygen wanted me to do Scott Peterson and Drew Peterson for them. Okay, I got bills to pay. These are stories. They're still compelling. I'm emotionally involved in these stories. Then, A&E wants to do Casey Anthony's Parents Speak. So finally I get to the point where I'm like, we keep telling these same stories. Yet over here, I have a plethora of compelling stories that happen to be of people of color, and I want to tell these stories. So, to answer your question, yes, I think, previously motivated by that. And I ever think since the pandemic hit and I locked down, and we all had the sort of our moments of clarity or what are we doing with our
yeah,
lives?
right. Yeah.
I spent a lot of that time on the phones with people like Nico Jenkins, who's, a TikTok sensation right now because they say if you look in his eyes, you die. Nico is a young man at 17 years old, a young man of color, severely mentally ill. There's no question about that. He was incarcerated for 20 years for carjackings, 3 carjackings,
Mm,
never got treated for his illness, did 5 years in solitary confinement leading up to his release. He wrote letters to everybody saying, please don't release me. I'm going to kill people. Within 10 days of being released, went on a killing spree and murdered 4 people, and then was able to defend himself in a death penalty trial while he's mentally ill. He now sits on death row. And I'm like, here's a failure of the system. And the victims' families tried to sue. Nico tried to sue the facility. He left 4 people shot and still alive that the police never connected the case because they were victims of color. He writes a letter to the newspaper saying, by the way, I shot those people too. I screwed up that day and missed. They're alive. And they throw all the lawsuits out. And then this is in Omaha, Nebraska, by the way, for anybody who cares. I find this document where all these senators and majority Republicans, and no offense to my Republican friends, but who were meeting behind doors with paperwork that said, let's discuss reform on the release of Nico Jenkins. But you're over here telling these people, well, your lawsuits are frivolous. We had nothing to do with it. So these are the kind of stories that I want to tell, and I'm currently involved in telling that when and I have to put my foot down and be like, I don't want to do Casey Anthony anymore. Yes, that was an injustice. Yes, she killed her daughter, and she got off. I don't want to really let's move the conversation forward and start telling compelling stories of injustice. Let's be transparent about our mistakes within the judicial system, and then we can fix it. But we
mm,
can't fix it if we don't talk about it. Stop
yeah.
sweeping it under the rug. And within that arena, there's compelling stories. So people are starting to come around to that, and so it's making my work more interesting.
That reminds me of a conversation I just had with an amazing, remarkable woman who I'm sure you've heard of, Donna Hilton.
Mhm.
And Donna Hilton, of course, went to prison for 27 years and is now one of the most amazing women's rights advocates and prison reform advocates in the country, and just completely transformed her life because of the experience. But one of the things that she discusses is the fact that she had come from a long history of trauma beginning as a child. And many women in prison have had such a similar story of abuse, and it led them down a path that, through some criminal activity got them in trouble. But you just said something very, very similar to what she said, which is that society is failing people before something happens, right? So we have to care more before they become criminals and identify things that we need to help them with before they harm themselves or others. And I think that is why your work is so important, because it sheds light on that too.
I mean, I one thing that I'm trying to do as a white American, because I can never separate myself from the problem, is I think that white people need to understand our role, our major role in the trauma of the Black community. Once we start to understand our responsibility for the trauma that the Black community suffers and start to have conversations about the trauma, then we can begin to figure out how to heal,
Mhm.
begin to figure out how to heal, and because I don't think that the Black community can heal alone if the white community isn't willing to accept the responsibility and the culpability of the historic and systemic racism that we created. And I say we because, again, I can't separate myself from the problem. Me telling people, oh, I grew up in Canada, it's different for me. That narrative is not helpful to the overall conversation. My role in as I grow, is to say, what stories can I tell through my genre? Because that's all I know. And how can I make a difference? I think, for one example, I'm flying to Chicago next week to do the compelling story of the murder of Yolanda Holmes. And I know the investigating officers very well. Full disclosure, Michelle is my podcast partner now because I admire her work. She worked tirelessly to solve Yolanda's murder. It took her a year. When the backlash was, the officers didn't care about the murder of their family member. It's not true. They just couldn't talk about the work that they were doing. I remember Michelle would call me up at night and be like, Steph, I was looking at these crime scene photos. She had the same shoes as me. She had the same knife holder. She bought this scarf hanging on the door at Target. I know she bought it there because I have the same one. Like her personal, and I'm like, okay, so how do I take those moments and tell those stories and show people that there is police officers that care?
Mm,
I know there's bad police officers and we see it and it's terrible,
yeah.
but there's a million good things that happen that don't get talked about as well, Corey.
Oh, I
And
love that. I love
you
that.
know, I mean, and I'm all about highlighting the terrible police officers. Drew Peterson's a horrible human being, a horrible police officer, or the things that happened to George Floyd, or any of these large cases. Let's shine a spotlight on that to see how we can move the conversation forward and begin to heal and fix. So that's really kind of where I'm at. I mean, I want to tell compelling stories,
Hmm.
and there's a pool of untold compelling stories that I feel like a responsibility to tell.
Steph Watts, thank you so much for your time today. And we really appreciate all the words of wisdom here you share with us on Motivational Mondays. It's been an absolute
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.